Hey, Jeff. So I want to just give sort of a brief discussion about recent developments and emerging issues on information for climate and weather. I mean, I think as advisors, there's this bombardment of information. I want to quickly sort of run through that, and I'm interested in the discussion on that. And sort of thinking about weather, short-term weather, seasonal forecast, and then climate change. So partly with all this bombardment of information, partly is to sort of build some frameworks to think about that a bit. And if you look at a lot of GRDC business discussion, they'll talk about operational aspects, about how we manage spraying and these sort of short-term aspects of operational things. Then tactical decisions, how much nitrogen to put on, and then questions of strategic thinking. And I think that sort of can tap across to these different factors and so on. So to start off with, just this difference between weather and climate, in one sense it's playing with words, but I think it's important when we think about how they're forecast and what they're doing and so on. So this is just an axis that has a log scale of size and a log scale of time. And you can see that we have these short-range weather forecasts in the coming hours over a day, which would be a local severe storm here or something. Then we have these seasonal forecasts, El Nino-based forecasts, what's happening with the subtropical ridge or what's happening with the Indian Ocean dipole or something, which is more this sort of seasonal aspect of, which are bigger scale and over this sort of year and so on. That ENSO should be down a little bit. And then this global warming at the top here, which is, as it says, global, and it's happening over long periods. However, these things cascade down too. So what's happening at this level comes down to this sort of level. So, but it is important to divide these off, partly because how weather is forecast is quite different to how seasonal climate work is done. So weather is basically forecast by looking at the current state of the weather and predicting that into the future. So if a Commodore was leaving Snowtown at a certain time this morning, you can pick up where it is and at what distance it's coming here. You're using its current status to predict the future. We don't do that with climate forecasts. That's about what is the ocean doing, and so we're changing the probabilities of things and so on. So one of the interesting aspects and one of the interesting developments we'll talk about a bit is the fact that actually some of the work on seasonal climate forecasts is actually coming back to this fortnight and monthly period. So just firstly, in terms of weather, in one sense, that's just an abundance of information. There's lots of apps, there's lots of information on that, and what's happened is we've just come to expect more and more. The Bureau of Meteorology has been doing lots of background work on this in terms of making their forecasts making their forecasts communicate better and have more spatial accuracy and going over for a longer time. So much of that's come up through this METI thing. So are people familiar with METI? So it's certainly a big development in terms of what's available. That's not to say that there's not lots of apps that pick up a similar sort of aspect to that. But in terms of weather forecast, in the last decade, obviously there's been this huge change in mobile phones and information communication technology. There's much more regional locations, so to an extent what was used to be available only for cities is now available for any grid point around Australia. So there's been a big change in that. This notion of a day a decade. So the forecasting into the future is getting just better and better. It's genuinely over the horizon type stuff. And as part of this, reasonably accurate forecast is seen as normal. So yes, the Bureau doesn't always get it right, but a Qantas pilot said to me, the Bureau's forecast is always right, you just get the date wrong sometimes. But even now, the date's right pretty much, even into 3 or 4 days into the future, 5 or 6 days into the future. I think in the next 5 years, there's these new satellites, this new Japanese satellite, which just greatly increases the precision of this. So we'll just see ongoing improvements in this area, and that's not because of agriculture wanting it. It's because it's because it's beneficial to everything for human health and for bushfires and for cyclones, and we can benefit from that. So there'll be big advances in this. Really, this more powerful supercomputers and this ability, this satellite data is really the trick to getting this right. So they're getting just so much more information about what's happening and the updating of that. This really interesting discussion about the Internet of Things. So basically the ability to link into some of these temperature sensors and so on. So I think there'll be, as these things become cheaper, how we use the forecast weather information through to local information and so on. And that's going to be something that's important. It's important, however, to think about these theoretical limits to prediction. And how far into the future. So as you start, obviously the most important point about this that I would stress is that, yes, you can get a 7-day, 14-day forecast, but it's pretty wise to update that, because obviously a week is a long time in politics, it's an incredibly long time in weather. And so getting the updated stuff is really important there. And so there's been some discussion about the problem of actually going too far into the future and taking that as having real precision and so on. But there's real benefits from that. Just really quickly running through this is what I got on last Thursday for today, the accuracy of these sort of forecasts of what the weather's going to be, of this sort of information and having it spatially available there. You can click on a site and look at what's going to happen in the future. This is very, very impressive over-the-horizon type information. You can then click on the detail and actually get for a location through the day and through the time and so on. And so I think this is just being picked up and being used. I guess the important point is to just be careful that as you go further into the future, there's that information becomes less sure, and it's well worth updating. But this is fantastic, and really I think one of the problems is that our expectation of what we can do at a seasonal level becomes higher because of this. There's also rainfall. Obviously, South Australia at the moment is a very dry place. This is the forecast into the future of the rainfall, just going through this time of where the rain's going. And I guess just an important point is that whilst you can go back and you can click on this 25% of more than, so if you're looking at a top dressing period or something, what you can do is actually look at the top quarter of rain, if that makes sense. So most of the rainfall is at this 50th percent of more than. So that's just, you can look at the chance of any rain, but you can also start looking at these more, the higher level of what's been predicted and so on. So again, I'd say looking at this, these factors here are obviously, there's a lot of information there. A lot of people are using this already for top dressing and for operational decisions, but I think it's actually excellent information that's been improved. It's been improved by some suggestions by agriculturalists and so on, and the ability to look at what the 50% chance of rain is, and then what the top quarter of rain is, and for some of these big wetting events. And we're doing some work to sort of say, could we use that for these nitrogen decisions and nitrous oxide decisions and so on, for what that wetter end is. So now, I guess moving quickly to seasonal climate forecast, I think a key thing that's happened over the last decade is that we're understanding the key drivers of climate a lot better. There was a lot less discussion from that. We've moved from a statistical system, the SOI or something, to dynamic systems. So this is basically using POAMA, so it's actually not trying to say what's the SOI doing, what's the Indian Ocean Dipole doing, but trying to understand that a bit better. And I think it's also fair to say over the last decade there's been a lot of promise, but it's disappointing. Part of that, in contrast to the spectacular success in numerical weather forecasting, the ability to give guidance on the coming season remains relatively limited, and I think that may improve, but I think it's the fair thing to say is that there's that the value of it is obvious, but the ability to do it with accuracy and timing is a problem. In the next 5 years, I think we'll be seeing more of POAMA, which is the Bureau's dynamic model, and they're heavily committed to that. This interesting work on the shorter term, the 2 to 8 week work. And so we've got a project with colleagues at Peter Grace working on, can we use this information for nitrogen decisions and so on. Also 3 to 6 months. So from POAMA, every fortnight, every 3 days, they provide the next, they run POAMA, which gives us for every location the next 9 months for every day, daily data for the next 9 months, and they give you 33 ensembles of that. So it's a huge amount of data, so there's a lot of information there. Another project that was mentioned this morning, working with James Risby from CSIRO, funded by GIDC, is can you use that, if you understand the synoptic systems that give us frost and heat, can we use POAMA to give us some guidance on that? Obviously, we would never say there'll be a frost in the second week of September, but we might say that, hey, from POAMA, the high pressure systems seem to be sitting in the bight in a way that might give us higher frost. We could also say that closer to the time, in August, that if this frost has started, maybe the likelihood of frost would be through the rest of the season may increase and so on. CSIRO, Steve Crimp and others are doing new approaches to statistical forecast, and that's a research area, and so we have some sort of different approaches of the POAMA and that's an area to watch and how we use that. I think an important development in the next decade is really saying, okay, we don't have these perfect forecasts, how do we use what we have? How do we use forecast? And I think it's an important area to keep working in. So in terms of just really quickly going through the drivers, we understand the drivers better. There's these, if you haven't seen it, the dogs from the, if you get onto the Victorians have done and the Bureau's done this, these 4 dogs and rounding up the weather and so on, and how they all have an influence, and how those different systems are affected at different times, in the ocean dipole and so on. I guess just an important point from last year, was it an El Nino, wasn't it an El Nino, what we were developing? My simple point is that an El Nino year, so here's some wheels for you, but they're not spinning, sorry. But basically, as you look from the all years, if I was a farmer at Snowtown, and this would be true for many areas of South Australia, and I would pay attention if someone was saying it's a La Nina or El Nino. It doesn't say we don't know what's going to happen for sure, but it sure changes the pattern on the wheel. And we see that the chances of a dry spring and a hotter spring greatly increasing with El Nino. Likewise, frost risk will go up with El Nino. That's part of that story. I think a real development here that happened last year was this El Nino alert. So again, the Bureau of Meteorology now gives you information on how they're thinking. And so you can actually see this sort of diagram here of where they are at different times and so on. And an important thing is that you can go back in time and see when they moved into an alert and a watch and so on. So the good thing is that these are now, this has come from the cyclone alert idea and so on, is that when they're not going to say, they're not saying we know what's going to happen, but they are saying where we might move these different things. Are we in a watch? Are we in an alert? Are we definitely in an El Nino event? And so I think this is fantastic that we're getting that information. We have a system where we're allowed to say what we think's happening. So you can see here that sometimes an alert moves into a La Nina, sometimes it moves into a full El Nino, sometimes you get an alert and it goes back to neutral. And we have to live with that, but it's good having that information. It's good background information. You can go through time and see what was happening in the past and so on. So I think this is a really good development. It gets away from the idea of you've got to tell us exactly what's going to happen, tell us what you're thinking about this, and we'll work out how to use that. Really importantly, the Indian Ocean dipole is an important factor here. There are 10 years that make up that map, and if you look at them, South Australia winter-spring rainfall, not always but generally, is affected by this positive Indian Ocean dipole. When we have El Nino years, there were of the 10 positive El Nino were positive. Sorry, 7 of the 10 positive Indian Ocean dipole were also El Nino years, so they often go together. But 3 were neutral years. So these are 3 neutral El Nino years. And you can see here that what the neutral El Nino years but positive IOD years tends to hit South Australia. It tends to be an area. So if I was in South Australia, I would pay attention to what the Indian Ocean dipole is doing. It seems to be making something that's a factor there. Just I'll quickly go. It's just the same story for the negative Indian Ocean dipole. But I guess one of the points is that we would move to is to then say, okay, maybe POAMA can pull all this together for us. And that would be a real hope of what POAMA may be able to do. And so again, POAMA has been around, and I still stand by what I'm saying, that this is disappointing. Well, initially I thought, beauty, this is going to give us really good guidance. I don't think that's been the case, but maybe and hopefully POAMA will improve into the future. So one of the things that the seasonal forecasts from the Bureau are starting to do now is that they actually are breaking it up into the individual months. So previously the information was all about the 3 months jumped together, okay? Because it's POAMA, because it's giving us data for every day into the future, what you can do is you can say here that February, the chance of getting rain in February is looking really dismal, okay? It's really, but March is a little bit less dismal. And there's a February to April period. So, but when we've looked at this a bit for last year for areas in Quirindi and New South Wales and so on, it started to give some information, this differentiation between individual months and so on. So, and there probably is some real information in that, and generally this next month information from POAMA is probably more accurate than the whole 3 month period, because 3 months is quite a big thing. So there's the forecast there. Again, this is this period. It'd be nice to have more information. It's not telling us a lot. It's certainly, but there's a slightly negative outlook for this sort of time here. Look at this forecast. What it's saying is 30 to 40% chance of exceeding the median. I want to come later to how the press has discussed that a bit, and that's part of our problem. So here we have that broken down for South Australia. And you can see that again, you can click on an individual site and you can go for an individual location, and you can go, it gives you the median rainfall for that period. The chance of above is unlikely, and it gives you here a graph of the chance of getting above 10 mils, 25, 50, 100, and the past accuracy they're saying is high. So this is actually starting to be a lot more information than there was. It's actually, you can click on it and you can see what's happening. So if you're top dressing, looking at spring and so on, there's more information that's starting to be there. And I think it's in agriculture we can start using it better. Again, this idea is we need to use these things to know which way to lean, not jump. They're nowhere near the short-term weather forecast accuracy. They're at a much more vague and changing the probability and so on, but it is starting to give us some information. So this is ABC Real. This is I put XXX to protect the guilty. So Mr. XXX said he does not believe farmers can benefit from planning for dry conditions. They just need to get on with farming. I agree with that, actually. I think that the important. I think Andrew Polkinghorne said. The problem with buying a seasonal forecast is you pay too much attention to it. So generally, an important thing to do is to just get on with farming and so on. How do we use this information? He says, if you were going to take notice of them, forecast, would you buy your fertiliser, he said? Would you grade your seed? Would you spray your weeds? Would you do all those things with a forecast that it wouldn't rain? I don't think we can afford to do that. Now, the problem is that this is not saying it's not going to rain, okay? I mean, if the forecast was saying it's not going to rain again, then maybe you wouldn't buy your seed and do your fertiliser and so on. But this speaks to part of the problem, is that what we're saying is that there's a reduction of getting above median rainfall, and that's translated into it's not going to rain. It's going to be completely dry. And so I think that's that's an inherent problem we have to deal with. So we need to think through how do we use forecasts that have skill but are still uncertain. And how do we incorporate this into risk management? There's a discussion about, people have said, prepare, don't predict. You can walk but not run, but you can prepare and predict. You can do both. You can chew gum and fart. You can do two things at once sometimes. So actually it's important to say that we can use some of the prediction stuff. And no one's saying predict and don't prepare, but we could be doing the two together. So I just want to quickly finish up with the big question about where does climate change fit into this, and how does that work up and down here. I guess what I'm saying is that we need to consider climate change through this. We need to consider how it impacts across these seasonal levels, and there, I'll just go to my my thing on climate change projections. I think over the last decade, climate change was over the horizon issue to now it's dominant discussion. And it's even to an extent, it's yesterday's discussion. So it's been sort of like, that was sort of 2007 type discussion, idea sort of thing. But basically, I'd say that climate change is there and it will continue. In terms of, in this convention centre, there was the greenhouse conference last year, and the main point from that is this is a maturing science. There's not all the new breakthroughs and this and so on. In the next 5 years, I guess I'd say, what we're moving towards is, rather than endless number of projections of climate change, this climate futures idea from CSIRO. So saying, here's a warmer, drier future, here's a much warmer, drier future. Now, these are the different futures. How likely are we to have that? There's emphasis on extremes and how that's going to do. And then there's really interesting discussion, it's about time and the real urgency to reduce our greenhouse gases, rather than the need to be urgent in adaptation. So yes, adaptation is really important, but we need to be careful about overemphasising the fact that farmers need to do a whole lot of adaptation tomorrow. And by saying all the impacts will be happening tomorrow. To an extent, this notion about watching what's happening. And so again, I use this simple line of, if you were going to plant a high chill peach orchard on the Adelaide Plains, I say you're an idiot. But if you were going to continue farming in a low rainfall area, that makes sense, because we don't know for sure. I mean, even though there's worrying aspects about climate change projections on rainfall, there's a lot of uncertainty about that. And so waiting to see how the precipitation works out is something that we can be waiting for there. Again, just finishing, I think that we can think through these things a little bit on this notion of this operational planning, and there's heaps of weather information for that, and that's part of what good farmers do, and that's even getting better and better. The tactical planning, it would be nice to have some seasonal information that can be of value there. I think there may be some information that we can start to include in there more, but still the amount of weighting isn't high. The strategic planning, that's about deciles and making these plans and so on. But I think the climate change projections should be part of the discussion with clients on strategic planning, but also how these things all work together. When you look at this, the literature on this stuff, usually it's about military or big organisations where you have a few people at the top doing the strategic planning, they give it to the tactical planning people, and then you have the people doing the operational aspect. Obviously for farmers, they're doing the whole lot. They're working up and down from the strategy down to the operational and backwards and forwards, and how they use weather and climate information, and your discussion with them is an important part of that.